Here we have Taylor performing chest flies. The muscles she will be working in this exercise are her deltoids and her biceps. The joints that are changing angles are her shoulder joint and shoulder girdle. Her starting position is with her feet planted on the floor in front of the bench, with her lumbar touching the bench as well as her cervical and the back of her skull. On her lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. The action her shoulder is performing is abduction. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. This action her shoulder is performing is shoulder joint adduction. Taylor performing a one-arm row. The muscles she will be working in this exercise are her biceps and deltoids. Her starting position is with one knee on the bench and one on the floor. Her lumbar and cervical and the back of her skull should be in line with each other. The joints that are changing angles are the elbow joint and the shoulder joint. On her lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. Her elbow joint is performing extension, while her shoulder joint is performing horizontal adduction. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. Her elbow is performing flexion, while her shoulder joint is performing horizontal adduction. Here we have Taylor performing a horizontal row. The muscles she will be working are her deltoids and her biceps. The grip for this exercise is in a pronated position. Her starting position is lying on her back and keeping her legs straight and looking up. The joints that are changing angles are her shoulder joints and elbow joints. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. Her shoulder joint is performing horizontal abduction and her elbow joint is performing flexion. On her lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. Her shoulder joint is performing a horizontal adduction and her elbow joint is performing extension. Taylor performing a bent over row. Her starting position is with her feet slightly shoulder distance apart and her knees slightly bent. The muscles she will be working are her biceps and deltoids. The joints that are changing angles are her shoulder joints and elbow joints. On her lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. On her lowering phase, her elbow joint is performing extension and her shoulder joint is performing flexion. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. On her lifting phase, her elbow joint is performing flexion and her shoulder joint is performing extension. Here we have Taylor performing glute ham raises. Her starting position is with her feet planted against the back of the machine and her knees placed on the balance area. Her back should be straight and looking forward. The muscles that she will be working in this exercise are her hamstring muscles and her glutes. The joints that are changing angle are her knee and hip joints. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. Her knee and hip joints are performing extension. Also on the lifting phase, you do not want to take a bow and bend forward. On her lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. Her knee and hip joints are performing flexion.
Here we have Sally performing the deadlift. Just kidding.
Here we have Taylor performing a deadlift. During this exercise, she will be using her gluteus maximus and her quads. Her starting position for a deadlift is with her feet shoulder width apart and firmly planted on the ground with her knees bent slightly. Her vertebrae and tailbone should be in an extended position and not flexed. She should be looking straight forward. The joints that are changing angles are her knee joint and hip joints on both lowering and lifting phase. On her lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and her knee joints are performing extension, and her flexion, and her hip joints are performing extension. On her lowering face, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is exhaling. Her knees are performing extension, and her hip joints are performing flexion. Here we have Taylor performing a Romanian deadlift. Her starting position are her feet are shoulder width apart and her knees are slightly bent. The bar should be at hip level. The joints that are changing angles during the lowering and lifting phase are the hip joints and the knee joints. On the lowering phase, she is performing an eccentric contraction and is inhaling. During this phase, her knee and hip joints are performing flexion. On the lifting phase, she is performing a concentric contraction and is exhaling. During this phase, her knees and hip joints are performing extension.
This is Sally. She's doing the back squat. So she starts with her feet shoulder width apart, knees slightly bent, not locked, and the bar on her traps. Okay, so the main joints that are moving are the hips and the knees. In the lowering phase, both joints are going through flexion, and on the lifting phase, both joints are going through extension. The primary muscle mover of the hips in the lowering is the gluteus maximus, and same for the lifting phase. For the knees, the primary muscle mover is the quads. In the lowering phase, it's an eccentric contraction, and on the lifting phase, it is concentric. This is Sally. She's doing the barbell front squat. Her feet should be shoulder width apart. Her knees should be slightly bent, not locked, and her elbows should be pointing straight out. Okay, so the joints that are changing angle are the hips and the knees. Both the hips and the knees are going through flexion in the lowering phase, and they're both going through extension in the lifting phase. The primary muscle mover of the hip is the gluteus maximus, and the primary muscle mover of the knee is the quads. In the lowering phase, it is an eccentric contraction, and the lifting phase is a concentric contraction. This is Sally. She's going to be doing the box squat. Her start position is her feet slightly apart, hips or knees slightly bent, and the barbell on her traps. So the joints that are changing angles are the hips and the knees. Both joints are going through flexion in the lowering phase, and both joints are going through extension in the lifting phase. The primary muscle mover of the hips is the gluteus maximus, and the primary muscle mover of the knees is the quads. The lowering phase is the eccentric contraction, and the lifting phase is a concentric contraction. This is Sally. She's doing the split squat. Her start position should be feet slightly apart, knees slightly bent, and the dowel on her traps. Okay. So the joints that are changing angle are the knee and the hip joint. On the lowering phase, both joints are going through flexion, and on the lifting phase, both joints are going through extension. The primary muscle mover of the knee is the quad, and for the hips, it's the gluteus maximus. On the lowering phase, it is an eccentric contraction, and on the lifting phase, it is a concentric contraction. This is Sally. She's doing pull-ups with a pronated grip, and she's starting off a bench. Okay, so the joints that are changing angle are the elbow joint, and the elbow joint is going through flexion in the lifting phase. The primary muscle mover of the elbow is the bicep, and the shoulder is going through extension, and the muscle mover is the latissimus dorsi. This is Sally. She's doing chin-ups in a supinated grip, and she's starting off the bench. So the main muscle, or the joints that are changing angle, is the elbow joint and the shoulder joint. The elbow joint is going through flexion and extension. The main muscle mover of the elbow is the bicep, and for the shoulder joint it goes through extension and flexion as well. And the main muscle mover is the latissimus dorsi. This is Sally, and she is going to be performing a bench press. Her starting position for a bench press is with her feet on the floor out in front of the bench. Her knees are stacked over her heels. Her lumbar should be rested on the bench. Her thoracic vertebrae is slightly elevated off the bench. Her cervical vertebrae are resting on the bench, as well as the back of her skull. The joints that are changing angles are her shoulder joint and elbow joint. During this exercise, the muscles she will be working are her pectoralis major and her tricep brachii. Her shoulder joint is performing horizontal abduction, and her elbow joint is performing flexion. On the lowering phase of this exercise, she is performing an eccentric contraction. On the lowering phase, she is inhaling. On the lifting phase of this exercise, she is performing a concentric contraction. On the lifting phase, she is exhaling because she is working against gravity.